He had two choices and approximately 90 seconds to make them. Sign everything Shin Do-hyuk had placed on that table, or walk out of that room and never see Tobias again. 11 years of patience had built to this single moment. 11 years of fabricated evidence, dismantled marriages, surveilled women, and stolen children. All of it converging on a father who had not even known he was a father until 3 hours ago, when a boy with his exact eyes had turned his head across the Marius ballroom and stopped the world completely. The boy was 4 years old. He had a velociraptor named Atlas. He had his father's eyes and his mother's composure, and he was somewhere Jae-won could not reach him. But Shin Do-hyuk had made one catastrophic miscalculation in 11 years of otherwise flawless preparation. He had never accounted for Amara. And right now, while Jae-won stared at those documents, Amara Osei was doing something on the other side of that wall that was about to make 11 years of patient revenge feel very, very small. Welcome to Afro-Korean Stories by K. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your location in the comments. Let me take you back to where this all began. To understand what happened at the Marius ballroom, you have to understand what kind of man Kang Jae-won was before Amara Osei walked into his life and quietly, permanently rearranged it. He had been built by discipline. Not the performative discipline of men who wake at 5 in the morning and post about it, but the kind that gets forged in genuinely difficult circumstances and never fully leaves the body. His father had died when Jae-won was 19, leaving behind a mid-sized infrastructure consultancy, a mountain of debt that nobody had told the family about, and 3 employees who deserved better than what the company's books suggested they were going to get. Jae-won had deferred university. Had walked into that office the Monday after the funeral in a suit that did not fit him properly, and sat in his father's chair and looked at the numbers until the numbers started making a different kind of sense. Not a comfortable sense. Not a reassuring one. But sense nonetheless. He had paid back every creditor within 4 years. Had rebuilt the consultancy into something his father would not have recognized and would have been proud of regardless. By 28 he had rebranded it as Vantara Group, pivoted from consultancy into development and infrastructure acquisition, and begun accumulating the kind of quiet, structural power that does not make headlines because it does not need to. By 35, Vantara Group had a hand in 11 major infrastructure projects across 4 continents: bridges, transit systems, water treatment facilities in places where clean water was not a given. The kind of work that his father had always said mattered more than the work that got celebrated. Jae-won celebrated none of it. He was already moving to the next thing. His assistant, Shin Yura, had worked for him for 7 years and had developed a precise taxonomy of his silences. There was the focused silence, which meant he was thinking and should not be interrupted. There was the strategic silence, which meant he had already decided something and was waiting for the room to arrive at the same conclusion. And there was the third silence, rarer, and the one she most carefully avoided disturbing, which had no professional name but which she privately thought of as the anniversary silence, because it appeared without fail on the 3rd of every month and lasted until sometime the following morning. She did not know what the 3rd of the month meant to him. She had never asked. Some things about a person belonged to them entirely, and Shin Yura was wise enough to recognize the difference between information that was her business and information that was simply present in the room. What she did know, because it was impossible to work in close proximity to someone for 7 years and not know the shape of their grief even when they never speak it aloud, was that whatever had happened 3 years ago had taken something from Kang Jae-won that his considerable resources had proven entirely insufficient to replace. He was effective. He was respected. He was, by every measurable standard, successful in the way that makes other successful people feel inadequate. He was also profoundly alone, in the way that men who have decided that managing things is preferable to feeling them tend to become. Now here is the part that changes everything. The part that nobody in Jae-won's professional world knew. The part that his board did not know, that the financial press did not know, that the 3 private investigators he had retained over the course of 36 months had been tasked with uncovering and had, each in their own way, failed to fully illuminate. 3 years before the night at the Marius ballroom, Kang Jae-won had been married. Her name was Amara Osei. She was Ghanaian by heritage, Seoul-based by choice, and a language specialist of extraordinary capability. Fluent in 6 languages, conversant in 4 more, with a particular gift for the cultural architecture that sits beneath language and determines what words actually mean when they are spoken by specific people in specific rooms. She had built a career translating not just words but intentions, not just sentences but the entire weighted history that particular sentences carry when spoken across cultural distances. They had met at a trade summit in Accra. He had said something in an interview about West African infrastructure that was technically accurate and contextually obtuse, and she had approached him at the opening reception and corrected him with a directness that was neither aggressive nor apologetic, simply the manner of a person who considers accuracy a form of respect. He had found it extraordinary. Not her directness alone, but the particular combination of precision and warmth with which she delivered it. As though she was correcting the statement because she thought well enough of him to believe he would want to know. They had talked for 4 hours that night. About roads and what they mean to a community. About his father, who had believed that infrastructure was a moral act. About her father, a civil engineer in Kumasi who had spent his career building things in places that needed them and had died believing the work mattered more than the recognition. Jae-won had flown back to Seoul and thought about her for 3 weeks before calling. He was not a man who called. He was a man who assessed, decided, and acted with a minimum of emotional exposure. Calling her felt like exposure. He called anyway. They were married 14 months later. Quietly. Against the considerable displeasure of his mother, who had a list of suitable candidates she had been maintaining for several years, and who received the news of the marriage with a specific tight-lipped composure of a woman who has decided that expressing her actual opinion would be counterproductive. Against the quiet, smiling, perfectly calibrated congratulations of Choi Hannah. And this Choi Hannah is where everything that came after was born. Choi Hannah had known Jae-won since university. That was the foundation of everything she had built between them. Not friendship exactly, but something that had the architecture of friendship without its essential honesty. She had been present at every significant moment of his adult life. His father's funeral, where she had sat beside him in the front row and said nothing, which was the right thing, and which she had known was the right thing, which told you something about her particular intelligence. The night he paid off the last creditor, when she had opened a bottle of something expensive and toasted him with the warmth of a person who genuinely wanted good things for him. She had wanted good things for him. Specifically, she had wanted to be one of them. This was not something she had ever said aloud. Choi Hannah was not a woman who said aloud the things that mattered most to her. She operated in the architecture of implication, of careful positioning, of being so consistently present and so consistently useful that her absence would eventually feel like loss. She had been executing this strategy for 11 years with the patience of someone who understood that the best opportunities are the ones you create rather than the ones you wait for. And then Amara Osei had walked into a reception in Accra and corrected Kang Jae-won's infrastructure assessment. And 14 months later Choi Hannah had sat in the second row of a quiet civil ceremony and smiled with every muscle in her face while something behind her eyes went very still and very cold. She had given herself 1 month to feel that coldness. 1 month, and then she had made a decision. Here is where it gets deeply unsettling, because what Choi Hannah did next was not impulsive. It was not emotional in the way that destructive things are usually emotional. It was architectural. It was the work of a highly intelligent person who had decided that a particular outcome was necessary and had begun, with extraordinary methodical precision, to construct the conditions that would produce it. The photograph came first. Amara at a dinner with a man named Park Sung-go, a cultural liaison who worked in the same non-profit sector. They had been colleagues for 3 years. The photograph showed them laughing, close together, at a table that looked intimate because Choi Hannah had chosen the angle carefully and the context had been removed with surgical precision. Then the emails. Constructed over 6 weeks, formatted with the metadata of Amara's actual accounts, containing language that was close enough to Amara's professional register to be plausible and different enough from her personal voice that anyone who truly knew her would have heard the wrongness immediately. Then the document. 42 pages suggesting that Amara had been in communication with a competing infrastructure firm, feeding proprietary information about 3 of Vantara Group's pending acquisitions in exchange for a consulting arrangement that had been deliberately structured to look like it predated the marriage. Jae-won had received all 3 in the space of 10 days. Through channels that appeared unconnected. through sources that appeared independent, through the particular delivery mechanism that Choi Hana understood better than almost anyone, the mechanism of a man receiving information that confirms a fear he has not yet admitted he was carrying. Because here was the thing about Kang Jae-won that Choi Hana knew and that Amara had been trying with increasing concern to make him see about himself. He loved with his whole capacity, but he trusted with enormous difficulty. Not because he was cruel, but because the 19-year-old who had sat in his dead father's chair and looked at the numbers had learned, in that moment, that the people closest to you can leave behind devastation that they never intended and that you nonetheless have to survive. He had rebuilt his father's company. He had never entirely rebuilt his willingness to be caught off guard by someone he loved. Choi Hana knew this. She had known it for 11 years. And she had used it with the precision of someone inserting a blade at exactly the right angle. Jae-won had not confronted Amara. He had looked at the evidence, all 42 pages of it, the photograph, the emails, and he had made the decision that he told himself was rational, and that was, in truth, the decision of a man who had chosen certainty over the terrifying vulnerability of being wrong. He had placed the divorce papers on the dining table one Tuesday morning. He had told Amara what he believed he knew. He had waited. She had looked at him for a long time. Not with the expression of someone caught. With the expression of someone witnessing something they had feared was possible and had now been shown was real. Then she had picked up the pen and signed. And left with one suitcase and the particular dignity of a woman who has decided that she will not beg to be believed by someone who has already chosen not to. What she had not told him, could not tell him in that moment in that kitchen with those papers on that table, was that she was 8 weeks pregnant. Now pay close attention here because this is the detail that reconstructs everything. She had known for 6 days. She had been trying to find the right moment, the right words, the particular careful approach that something so significant deserved. And then the moment had been taken from her entirely, replaced by a table with documents on it, and a man looking at her like she was a verdict he had already delivered. She had signed. She had left. She had told herself on the flight she booked that same afternoon to Accra, that she was protecting the child. That a man who could look at her that way, who could choose a folder of paper over the person standing directly in front of him, was not a man she was going to place a child in front of and beg. She had been right about some of that. She had also been wrong about some of it. 3 years of raising Tobias alone had given her considerable clarity about which was which. 3 months after the divorce, one of Jae-won's security team had uncovered something during a routine background check. A digital thread. One that, followed with sufficient persistence, led not to Amara but directly, irrefutably, to Choi Hana. Every photograph staged. Every email constructed. The entire 42-page document, fabricated with meticulous care by the one person Jae-won had never thought to look at. He had sat with that information for 4 days before he could stand up properly. And now, 3 years later, he was crossing the Marius ballroom with the controlled urgency of a man who has run out of time to be careful. He caught her at the threshold of the east corridor, where the ballroom's ambient light gave way to the cooler, narrower illumination of the hallway beyond. She had almost made it. 3 more seconds and she would have been in the corridor, and then the elevator, and then the street, and then the particular invisibility that she had spent 3 years perfecting. He said her name once. Not loudly. He did not need to say it loudly because he said it with everything that had accumulated behind it over 3 years, and that weight carried it further than volume could have. He stopped. She did not turn immediately. She stood with her back to him for a moment that lasted considerably longer than its actual duration, and in that moment Jae-won could see the precise instant she made her decision, the slight squaring of her shoulders, the infinitesimal lift of her chin. The same preparation he remembered from every difficult conversation they had ever had. She had always braced herself like that. Like she was deciding in advance how much of herself she was willing to let the next few minutes reach. He turned. He had prepared himself in the 4 seconds between her name and her turning, for many versions of her face. Anger, coldness, the careful blankness of someone who has decided that no expression is safer than the wrong one. He had not prepared himself for what was actually there, which was simply exhaustion. Not the tired kind, but the deep, structural exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has become so accustomed to its weight that they have stopped noticing it until someone makes them put it down. She looked at him the way you look at something you have grieved completely and thought you were finished with. "The child," he said. His voice did something at the edges that he could not entirely govern. "How old is he?" It was not entirely a question. They both understood that. Something moved across her face. A calculation, rapid and private. "I need to leave, Jae-won." "Amara," I said. "How old is he?" The string quartet in the ballroom shifted into something slower. Around them the corridor was empty, the party proceeding on the other side of the wall with complete indifference to the fact that something irrevocable was happening in its margins. "4," she said. "He turned 4 in August." He did the arithmetic that he had already done the moment he had seen the child's eyes across the ballroom. He did it again now because the body sometimes requires confirmation that the mind has already accepted. August. 4 years old. She had been pregnant when she signed. "You knew," he said. "Yes. When you signed those papers. You already knew." "Yes." The word was quiet. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Simply factual, in the way that Amara had always delivered the things that cost her the most. As plain, unadorned truth, because she had never believed that difficult things became easier through decoration. "Why didn't you?" He stopped. Understood, even as he was forming the question, exactly why she hadn't. Understood it with the clarity of a man who has spent 3 years reconstructing a single morning from every possible angle. He had put papers on a table. He had looked at her like a verdict. He had not asked a single question. "You already know why," she said. He did. That was the worst part. He did know why. And the knowing sat in his chest like something with genuine mass, pressing against the inside of his sternum with a persistence that no amount of professional discipline was going to redistribute. "I know about Se-rin," he said. "I have known for almost 3 years." Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise. She had known he would find out eventually. Had known it with the certainty of someone who understands that fabricated things have a finite lifespan. But something adjacent to surprise. Something that looked like the faint, complicated relief of a person who has been the only one carrying a particular truth for a long time and has just been told they no longer have to carry it alone. "I know," she said quietly. "You knew I'd found out. Someone told me. About 14 months ago. The information landed with a specific kind of impact. 14 months. She had known for 14 months that he knew the truth, and she had still not contacted him. Had still packed whatever life she had built here into boxes and booked 2 seats on a flight to Accra and continued, with extraordinary composure, to leave. "And you still chose to go," he said. "I chose to protect my son." There was no heat in it. That was the thing about Amara that had always undone him. She was most formidable when she was quietest. "I built something here, Jae-won. In 3 years I built a life for Tobias that is stable and good and entirely his own. He has never once gone to sleep uncertain about whether his mother would be there in the morning. He has never once been handed a verdict without a conversation." He paused. "I was not going to dismantle what I built for him simply because the man who made it necessary had discovered he was wrong." The words were not cruel. They were precise. There is a difference, and Amara had always understood it. "His name is Tobias," Jae-won said. "Yes. After your father's colleague, the engineer." She looked at him carefully. The fact that he remembered that, a detail from a conversation in Accra 5 years ago, a name she had mentioned once in passing, did something to her expression that she did not entirely manage to suppress. "Yes," she said again, softer this time. "I want to meet him. Jae-won. Not tonight. Not like this." He gestured slightly at the corridor, the ballroom beyond, the entire inappropriate grandeur of the setting. "I'm not asking for tonight. I'm asking you to consider it. That's the entirety of what I'm asking for right now. Consideration." She studied him for a long moment. The Amara he remembered had been warm in the way that genuinely secure people are warm. Openly, without calculation. The woman in front of him was still warm. He could sense it underneath everything, but it was protected now. Layered. The warmth of someone who had learned that open things get damaged and had made the necessary architectural adjustments. "I'm leaving in 2 days," she said. "I know." Savannah Air, morning departure. Her eyes sharpened. "You had me investigated. I needed to find you before you disappeared again." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to apologize for that." "No," she said. "I don't imagine you are." A pause that had considerable texture. 2 days, he said. "Give me one conversation before you go. Not about legal arrangements. Not about rights or documentation or anything that involves lawyers. One conversation, as two people who owe each other more honesty than they ever managed while they were married." She was quiet for long enough that he understood she was genuinely considering it rather than simply constructing a refusal. "I'll think about it," she said finally. She walked back toward the ballroom, back toward Tobias and the older woman, and the rest of the evening she had been trying to navigate before he had said her name in a corridor and made everything complicated again. He stood in the hallway for a long time after she left. And then, because he was Kang Jae-won and standing still had never once in his life solved anything, he took out his phone and called Beck. "I need everything," he said. "Not surveillance. History. Who she is, what she's built, where she's going. And I need a paternity test arranged through Dr. Lim with full discretion. I need results within 24 hours. Beck did not ask questions. This was why Jae-won paid him the way he paid him. "One more thing," Jae-won said. "Find out everything you can about a non-profit trade organization called the Osei Lim Cultural Bridge Initiative. She's been working there for approximately 3 years. And Beck. Find out who else has been watching her." He hung up, stood in the corridor of the Marius ballroom while 460 guests continued their evening on the other side of the wall, entirely unaware that the most significant negotiation of Kang Jae-won's life had just begun. And it had nothing to do with Southeast Asia. The results came back in 19 hours. Beck was thorough in the way that people who have spent decades in security work become thorough. Not just collecting information but understanding which information sits beneath the information, the sediment layer of context that determines what facts actually mean. He had compiled everything into a document that Jae-won read at 4 in the morning in his penthouse, sitting at the window that looked out over Seoul with a glass of water he had forgotten to drink. Amara Osei had arrived in Seoul 3 years ago with one suitcase, a 4-month pregnancy she had told no one about, and a professional reputation that had preceded her through channels she had not cultivated intentionally. The director of the Osei Lim Cultural Bridge Initiative, a man named Director Kwon, who had been trying to recruit her for 2 years before she finally accepted, had described her in an internal memo as the most instinctively capable cross-cultural negotiator he had encountered in 30 years of development work. She had negotiated 2 of the organization's 3 largest corporate partnerships in the past 2 years. She had declined 3 promotions, each time citing Tobias as her reason, each time recommending a colleague instead with the specificity of someone who had actually assessed the candidates rather than simply deflecting. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Seohyun district that she had made, according to the building manager who Beck had spoken to with his particular brand of diplomatic persistence, into something that smelled of cardamom and had children's drawings on the refrigerator and a small garden on the balcony that she tended with visible dedication. Tobias attended a bilingual nursery 4 mornings a week. He was, by the account of his primary teacher, a woman named Ms. Song who had apparently needed very little encouragement to discuss her students' attributes, extraordinarily composed for his age, with a vocabulary that consistently surprised adults and a habit of asking questions that followed the logical architecture of someone who was genuinely trying to understand things rather than simply seeking attention. He had recently, Ms. Song reported with what appeared to be affectionate exasperation, become comprehensively obsessed with velociraptors. He had named his primary velociraptor Toy Atlas. He carried Atlas everywhere. He had given a 3-minute unsolicited presentation to his nursery class about velociraptor hunting strategies that had left 2 children frightened and the rest deeply impressed. Jae-won read this and sat with it for a while. His son. His son had given a presentation on velociraptor hunting strategies at the age of 4. The paternity result was on the second page of the document. 99.99%. He had known before he opened the envelope, had known since the moment in the ballroom when those particular eyes had found his across the room, but seeing it documented, seeing it rendered in the irrefutable language of science and probability, made it real in the specific way that only written things can make things real for men who have built their lives on documentation. He set the document down, picked up the water glass, set it down again without drinking, and then he read the third section of Beck's report. The one that Beck had flagged with a single word at the top of the page, underlined twice. The word was complication. Amara had been watched, not by Jae-won's people, not by anyone connected to Vantara Group, by someone else entirely, and for reasons that the document outlined with the careful, factual neutrality of a man who understood that the information he was delivering was going to destabilize something significant. For the past 8 months, a private security firm called Jong-on Consulting had been maintaining surveillance on Amara Osei. Her apartment, her office, Tobias's nursery, the routes she walked, the people she met. The surveillance was sophisticated, not aggressive, not threatening in any overt way, but consistent and comprehensive in a manner that spoke of serious resources and serious intent. Jong-on Consulting was a firm that Jae-won recognized, not because he had used them, 'cause he knew who did. He turned to the fourth page of the document. Beck had anticipated the question. Jong-on Consulting's primary retained client for the past 4 years was a private family office operating under the name Kang Jae-won Holdings. Jae-won set the document down very carefully on the table in front of him. Kang Jae-won Holdings was his mother. He sat with that for considerably longer than he had sat with anything else in the document. His mother, who had called weekly for the first year after the divorce asking when he planned to find someone suitable, who had received the news of Amara with tight-lipped composure, and the word unsuitable delivered with the precision of a woman who believed she was simply being honest, who had, when the divorce was finalized, said perhaps for the best in a tone that he had told himself at the time was simply her way. His mother had known about Tobias. Had to have known. If Jong-on had been watching Amara for 8 months, they had been watching a woman with a 4-year-old child who had his client's eyes, and no competent surveillance firm delivers a report without noting the most significant detail in it. His mother had known, and had said nothing. Jae-won stood up from the table, walked to the window, looked out at Seoul in the early morning, the city still mostly dark with a particular darkness that exists just before the light begins its incremental reclamation of the sky. He thought about the kind of person who watches a woman raise a child alone for 8 months and says nothing, who sits across from her son at family dinners and asks politely about quarterly projections and says nothing, who has known for 8 months that her grandchild exists somewhere in the Seohyun district learning velociraptor hunting strategies and carrying a toy named Atlas, and who has made the calculation, precise, deliberate, architectural, that this information is more useful undelivered. He thought about what that calculation required. The coldness of it. Patience. He recognized both. He had inherited both. He had spent 30 years believing that precision and patience were simply the tools of effective people, and he was standing at his window at 4 in the morning understanding, with a clarity that was genuinely unpleasant, that tools have no inherent morality and that the hands that shaped his had not always used them well. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. His mother. He let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he answered. "You know," he said. No greeting. No preamble. A silence on the line that confirmed everything before she said a word. "Jae-won. You have known for 8 months that I have a son." His voice was level. It was the most dangerous version of his voice, the one with no temperature in it at all. "You have sat across from me at dinner. You have called me every Sunday. You have asked me about the Vantara Group's Southeast Asia projections and whether I was eating properly and when I intended to think about my future. And you said nothing. I was protecting you." Her voice was composed. His mother's voice was always composed. He understood now where he had learned it and felt considerably less admiring of the skill than he once had. From what? From making a decision based on sentiment rather than from my own child. The level voice held. You were protecting me from my own child. I was protecting the Kang family from a complication that. Do not, he said, finish that sentence. She did not finish it. I am going to see Amara tomorrow, he said. I am going to meet my son. I am going to do whatever is required to be present in his life and to make right what was made wrong. And I am going to do all of this regardless of what you believe the Kang family requires. He paused. And you and I are going to have a very thorough conversation about what else you have decided I do not need to know. But not tonight. He ended the call. Stood at the window until the sky began, incrementally, to change. His mother had known. But here is the thing that Beck's report had not yet revealed. The thing that was sitting in the fifth and final page of the document, which Jae-won had not yet reached because the fourth page had stopped him entirely. He picked the document back up, turned to page 5, and read something that made the Seoul skyline go very quiet around him. Jong-on Consulting had not only been watching Amara. They had also, for reasons that the document outlined with Beck's characteristic careful neutrality, been in recent communication with Choi Hana. Choi Hana had been released from every professional obligation connected to Jae-won's world 14 months ago. He had done it quietly, without public explanation, in the manner of a man who understood that some forms of accountability are more effectively delivered through permanent consequence than through confrontation. She had lost her position at Vantara Group, her seat on 2 subsidiary boards, and the considerable professional network that proximity to Kang Jae-won had afforded her over 11 years. He had not destroyed her publicly. He had simply closed every door that his influence had previously held open, and let the resulting silence speak with a particular eloquence of closed doors. He had believed that was the end of it. He had been wrong. Beck's report indicated that Choi Hana had made contact with Jong-on Consulting approximately 6 months ago. Not as a client. She no longer had the resources to retain a firm of that caliber. As a source, she had been providing information. Specifically, information about Amara's professional movements, her organizational affiliations, the details of her pending relocation to Accra that suggested an inside knowledge of Amara's plans that went considerably beyond what was publicly available. Which meant Choi Hana had a source of her own inside Amara's life. Jae-won read that sentence 3 times. Let its full implication assemble itself without rushing it. Someone close to Amara, close enough to know the details of a relocation that had not been publicly announced, was feeding information to Choi Hana, who was feeding it to a surveillance firm retained by his mother, who had been using it to monitor a woman and child she had decided were a complication rather than a family. 3 separate actors. 3 separate agendas. All of them converging on the same woman, who had spent 3 years believing she had successfully disappeared and built something safe, and who had been, the entire time, at the center of a surveillance architecture she knew nothing about. Jae-won closed the document, set it on the table with a precision that was the external expression of something internally very close to fury, the cold, structural kind that does not dissipate quickly and does not spend itself in gesture. He called Beck. The source inside her organization, he said. How long to identify them? I have a strong candidate, Beck said. He had clearly not slept either. Director Kwon's administrative coordinator, a man named Lee Byung-soo. The communication patterns are consistent, and the timing aligns with Hannah's information cycle. Is Amara safe right now? Pause. That was a fraction too long. Currently, yes. But the relocation to Accra creates a transitional window that is less predictable. During a move, routines change. Security gaps open. Then we're not waiting for a convenient moment to have a conversation, Jae-won said. Get me a meeting with Amara today. Use the same channel as before. Tell her. He stopped, thought carefully about what needed to be said and what needed to be withheld until he could say it in person, where he could see her face and she could see his, and there was no distance between them for misinterpretation to take root. Tell her that what I need to discuss concerns Tobias's safety directly. Tell her I would not use those words if I did not mean them precisely. Another pause. She may not receive that well. It may feel like leverage. It is not leverage. It is the truth. And she will know the difference. He paused. She has always been better than me at knowing the difference. He ended the call. Stood in the early morning penthouse with Seoul changing color outside his window and the document on his table and the specific, compounding weight of understanding exactly how many people had made decisions about Amara Osei's life without her knowledge or consent. His mother, Choi Hana, Lee Byung-soo, whoever he was and whatever he had been promised. 3 people who had looked at a woman building something good from the wreckage of what had been done to her and had decided, each for their own carefully reasoned purpose, that she was a variable to be managed rather than a person to be left alone. He thought about what Amara had said in the corridor of the Marius ballroom. He has never once been handed a verdict without a conversation. She had been talking about Tobias, about the way she had raised him. But she had also been talking about herself, and about what had been done to her, and about the standard she had set for her own life in direct response to the standard that had been catastrophically failed in her marriage. She deserved to know what was happening around her. She deserved to walk onto that plane to Accra, if she was going to walk onto it, with full knowledge of every hand that had been in the architecture of her life. She deserved, at absolute minimum, the information required to protect herself and her son. The meeting was arranged for 11 o'clock that morning. A different cafe this time. Amara's choice again, because Jae-won had made it clear through Beck's channel that she should choose the ground and he would come to it. A place in the Gaywan Quarter, smaller than the last, with a proprietor who knew her well enough to have her order ready when she arrived. She was already there when he walked in. This surprised him. He had arrived 12 minutes early, which was his standard, and she was nonetheless already seated at a corner table with a coffee she had not touched and an expression of careful, contained attention that told him she had been there for a while and had used the time to prepare. He sat across from her. In the daylight, without the Marius ballroom's atmospheric lighting and the disorientation of the encounter, he could see her more clearly. She was wearing a dark green jacket over a white shirt, professional but not formal, and there were faint shadows under her eyes that told him she had slept about as well as he had. Her hands were around the coffee glass with a steadiness that he recognized as deliberate. "You said it concerns Tobias's safety," she said. No greeting. She had learned that from him once, the efficiency of beginning where the substance was, and he felt the particular complexity of recognizing his own habits in someone he had failed. Yes. He did not soften it. She would not respect the softening. "I need to tell you something that is going to be difficult to hear, and I need you to let me tell it completely before you respond, because the full picture is considerably more important than any single piece of it." She looked at him steadily. "Then tell it." He told it. He told her about Jong-on Consulting, and the 8 months of surveillance, and his mother's retained relationship with the firm. He watched her face as he said it, watched the careful composure hold, and then develop a specific tension around the eyes that was not quite shock but was the expression of someone receiving confirmation of a fear they had carried quietly and had hoped was unfounded. She had suspected she was being watched. He could see that in her face. She had suspected it and had not known by whom or why, and had done what capable people do when they suspect a threat they cannot fully identify. She had accelerated her departure. The relocation to Accra was not simply a new opportunity. It was, at least in part, an exit. He told her about Choi Hana, about the 6 months of communication with Jong-on, about the inside source and Lee Byung-soo, and the information channel that had been running through her professional life without her knowledge. At the name Lee Byung-soo, something happened to her face that was more than tension. It was the specific, visceral expression of betrayal. Not surprise, because somewhere in her she had apparently already known that the leak was close, but the full-body recognition of which particular person had been standing near her and quietly, methodically, dismantling her privacy. "He recommended me for this role," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Lee Byung-soo. He was the one who told Director Kwon I was available. I thought," she stopped, reconstructed. "I thought he was a colleague." "I know. How long?" "Beck believes from close to the beginning. Possibly from before you arrived in Seoul." She set her coffee glass down, looked at the table for a moment. then looked up, and in her eyes was something that Jae-won had not seen there before. Not in the corridor last night, not in any version of her face he had constructed from memory over 3 years. It was the particular exhaustion of someone who has been strong for a very long time and has just been shown that the ground they were being strong on was less solid than they believed. So the entire time, she said. The entire 3 years. Someone was always watching. Yes. Tobias's nursery. Yes. She was quiet for a moment that had considerable weight. Then she said, in a voice that was steady in the way that very controlled things are steady. Your mother. She has known about Tobias for 8 months. She has known she has a grandchild and she chose to. She stopped. Started again. She used that knowledge as what? Information. Leverage. What was she planning to do with it? I don't know yet, Jae-won said. That is one of several conversations I intend to have today that will not be comfortable for anyone involved. He paused. But I needed you to know first. Before any of those conversations happen. Because this is your life and your son, and you have been making decisions for 3 years without the full information available to you. And I will not allow that to continue. She looked at him for a long time. Why? She said finally. Not combatively. Genuinely. As though she was trying to locate the motivation behind the transparency and could not quite place it. Because you deserved better than what you were given 3 years ago, he said. And I cannot change that. But I can make sure that from today, every decision you make is made with everything I know available to you. That is. He paused. Found the precise word. That is the minimum of what I owe you. Cafe was quiet around them. Outside, the Jae-won quarter was going about its late morning business with complete indifference. Amara looked at her untouched coffee. Then at him. There is something else, she said. Her voice had changed. Something in it had shifted into a register he did not immediately recognize. Careful in a new way, the carefulness of someone approaching something they have been moving toward for a long time and are now finally close enough to touch. Tell me, he said. She reached into the bag beside her chair, placed a document on the table between them, slid it toward him with the precise, unhurried movement of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times and has decided that when it came, she would simply be direct. He looked at the document. Read the heading. Read it again. And Kang Jae-won, who had not been caught off guard in 11 years, felt the entire careful architecture of everything he thought he understood about the past 3 years quietly, completely come apart. The document was a custody agreement. Not the kind that lawyers draft in anticipation of a dispute. The kind that someone drafts in anticipation of their own absence. It was detailed, precise, and had been notarized 8 months ago. Around the same time, Jae-won noted with a stillness that was entirely internal, that Jong-on Consulting had begun their surveillance. The document named Kang Jae-won as Tobias's legal father and outlined, in the careful language of someone who had thought about every contingency, the conditions under which he would assume full guardianship of their son. In the event that Amara was unable to care for Tobias herself. He read it twice. Then he looked up at her. You knew something was wrong, he said. I suspected. She had both hands flat on the table now, the posture of someone grounding themselves deliberately. 8 months ago things started feeling misaligned. Small things. A conversation I had with Director Kwon that he referenced later with details I had not given him. A route I changed that someone seemed to anticipate. Nothing definitive. Nothing I could point to and name. He paused. But I have spent 3 years being very careful about Tobias. And careful people develop a sensitivity to the feeling of being observed. Feels different from ordinary life. It has a particular texture. Why didn't you contact me? Because I did not know if you were the one watching. She said it without accusation, simply as the logical fact it was. You had resources. You had motivation. I had disappeared with your child. I did not know for certain that the surveillance was not yours. The candor of it landed with considerable impact. She had spent 8 months not knowing if the man who had the most obvious reason to find her was the threat she was trying to protect herself and Tobias from. She had been navigating that uncertainty alone, without telling anyone, drafting contingency documents and accelerating relocation plans and performing composure for a 4-year-old who needed to believe his world was stable. "I would never," he began. "I know that now," she said. "I did not know it 8 months ago. I knew who you were when we were married, and I knew who you were when you put those papers on the table, and those two versions of you were different enough that I was not willing to assume I knew which one would show up if you found me." That is not an accusation. It is an accounting. He accepted it as one. The document. You were preparing for the possibility that whoever was watching you intended something more than surveillance. I was preparing for the possibility that I might not always be there. She said it plainly, with a particular plainness of someone who has stared at a frightening thing long enough that it has lost its power to destabilize them through euphemism. Tobias needed someone. If something happened to me, he needed a person who was his, legally and completely. Whatever had passed between us, you are his father. That does not change because our marriage failed. Jae-won looked at the document on the table between them. At the careful precision of its language. At the notary stamp from 8 months ago. At the name she had written in the guardianship clause. His name, Kang Jae-won, the man she had every reason not to trust, and he understood what it had cost her to write it there. What it said about the quality of her judgment and her integrity, and the particular strength of a person who is capable of separating what they feel from what is right. "You prepared this," he said, "while believing I might be the one surveilling you." "Yes. And you still named me." "He is your son," she said simply. "My feelings about you are not his to inherit." The cafe owner moved quietly at the far end of the room, pretending with admirable commitment to be entirely occupied with something behind the counter. Outside, a light rain had begun against the Jae-won quarters windows, the kind that arrives without announcement and settles in as though it intends to stay. Jae-won looked at the document for a moment longer. Then he slid it back across the table toward her. "Keep it," he said. "I hope you never need it. But keep it." He paused. "And then, when you are ready, not today, not under these circumstances, I would like to talk about a different document. One that is not contingency planning. One that is simply his father being present in his life because his father intends to be present in his life, and wants that to be a legal and permanent reality rather than a goodwill arrangement that can be revoked." She did not respond immediately. She looked at the document he had slid back to her, and then at the rain against the window, and then at him with the expression of a woman doing a very complex internal calculation that involved not just the present moment but the entire accumulated weight of every moment that had preceded it. "There is something you do not know yet," she said. Something in her tone recalibrated the atmosphere of the entire conversation. Not dramatically. Subtly, the way a temperature change is subtle until you realize you are cold. "Tell me," he said. "Lee Byung-soo." She said the name with a careful enunciation of someone handling something they have not yet finished being angry about. "I told you I thought he was a colleague. That is true. But there is a layer beneath that which I have been trying to understand for the past 6 weeks, ever since I found a discrepancy in a communication record that I was not supposed to find." She reached into her bag again, placed a second document on the table. This one was not notarized. It was a printed email thread, the kind that has been reconstructed from fragments rather than exported cleanly, the kind of document that someone produces through considerable effort from materials that were not meant to be reassembled. Jae-won looked at the email thread. Read the first exchange. Then the second. Then he reached the third and stopped. The emails were between Lee Byung-soo and a correspondent identified only by a numbered address. The content was operational. Times, locations, Amara's schedule, Tobias's nursery pickup arrangements. The kind of logistical detail that surveillance requires and that only someone with genuine daily proximity could provide. But it was the attachment in the fourth email that stopped him. Photograph. Not of Amara. Not of Tobias. Of Jae-won himself. Taken recently, the timestamp indicated 3 weeks ago. Outside the Vantara Group building. Captured from a distance with a quality of lens that indicated professional equipment. On the back of the photograph, visible because the image had been scanned flat rather than cropped, was a single handwritten line. He read the line. Read it again. Looked up at Amara. "He was not watching you for my mother. Jae-won said slowly. Or not only for my mother. No, Amara said. I do not believe he was. Then who? She looked at him with the expression he was beginning to recognize as her particular form of dreading the delivery of difficult information. Not reluctance exactly, but the careful pause of someone who understands that some sentences, once spoken, permanently alter the architecture of the room they are spoken in. The handwriting on the back of that photograph, she said. I have seen it before. Once, a long time ago. On a card that came with flowers delivered to our apartment. You were traveling. I thought it was from a client. He paused. I kept the card because the handwriting was distinctive. I have kept many things, Jae-won. I am a careful person. I keep things that feel significant even when I cannot yet identify their significance. She reached into her bag one final time. Placed a small card on the table. Aged slightly, the edges soft with time. The kind of card that has been stored carefully in a place where it would not be damaged. The handwriting on the card matched the handwriting on the back of the photograph with a precision that required no expert analysis. Jae-won read the card. It was brief. 4 lines. The kind of message that reads on the surface as entirely innocuous. Warm, congratulatory, professionally appropriate. But the name signed at the bottom was not a client. It was not anyone from Vantara Group. It was not anyone connected to Choi Hana or Jong-on Consulting or his mother's private family office. It was a name that Jae-won had not heard in 11 years. A name connected to a period of his life that predated Vantara Group, predated his father's death, predated almost everything he had constructed of himself since the age of 19. A name attached to a man who had, as far as Jae-won had believed with complete certainty, been permanently removed from any proximity to his life. A man named Shin Do-hyuk. Jae-won set the card down on the table with a steadiness that cost him considerably more than it appeared to. Where did you get the photograph, he said. His voice had gone to its most level register. The one with no temperature. It was delivered to my apartment, Amara said. Anonymous. 3 days ago. With a note. She slid one final piece of paper across the table. A single line, printed rather than handwritten. The anonymity of it more unsettling than any signature would have been. He read it. He read it again. The rain intensified against the cafe windows. The owner at the far end of the room had gone very still in the way that people go still when they have accidentally become proximate to something they understand. Instinctively, they should not be proximate to. The note said, "Tell him what you found. Tell him before the gala. Tell him or the boy goes to Accra without you." Amara had received this note 3 days ago. 3 days before the Maria's ballroom. Before Jae-won had seen her across the room and felt the floor shift beneath 11 years of carefully maintained equilibrium. She had not been at the gala by accident. She had been told to be there. She had been told to be there. Jae-won let that sentence sit in the room between them without rushing past it, because rushing past it would have been a way of not fully absorbing what it meant. Amara Osei had not walked into the Maria's ballroom by coincidence. Had not been at that window in that burgundy dress with Tobias on her hip, because the evening had unfolded naturally in that direction. Someone had positioned her there. Someone had known that Jae-won would be at the gala, had known his route through the room, had calculated the precise coordinates of an encounter that would appear, to everyone including Jae-won himself, to be the random collision of 2 people and 3 years of unresolved history. It had been a construction. Elaborate, patient, and executed with a sophistication that told him the person behind it had been planning it for considerably longer than 3 days. "You came anyway," he said. The note mentioned Tobias. Her voice was steady, but her hands, still flat on the table, had pressed slightly harder against the surface. There was no version of that sentence in which I did not comply. Whatever was being orchestrated, whatever agenda was being served by my being in that room, none of it mattered against the possibility that my son was at risk if I refused. You should have contacted me before. I did not know if you were part of it. She said it quietly, with the finality of a door closing on an argument before it opens. I have already told you that. I did not know whose hand was behind the note. I did not know if walking into that ballroom was walking into safety or further into whatever this is. I made the calculation that a room full of 460 witnesses was safer than whatever the alternative might be. He could not argue with the logic. It was, in fact, exactly the calculation he would have made. Shin Do-hyuk, he said. He needed to say the name aloud in front of her, needed to hear how it sounded in the present tense rather than the archived past where he had kept it for 11 years. You have never heard that name before. Never. Not until the photograph. He is not someone connected to any current part of my life. He is not someone I have had contact with since I was 22 years old. He paused, decided that she had earned the full accounting. He was my father's business partner, junior partner. My father held the primary stake in the original consultancy. When my father died, the partnership agreement entitled Shin Do-hyuk to a 30% claim on the company assets. Amara was listening with the complete, architectural attention she gave to things that mattered. I contested it, Jae-won continued. I was 19. I had no legal experience, inadequate representation, and a grief I had not yet learned to separate from my decision-making. But I had the company's financial records, and those records showed a pattern of unauthorized withdrawals over the preceding 2 years that originated from Shin Do-hyuk's access credentials. He paused. He had been systematically extracting capital from a company that was already struggling. The debt my father left behind was not my father's mismanagement. It was theft. Slow, methodical, and conducted by someone my father trusted completely. You proved it. Eventually. It took 14 months and cost nearly everything the company had left. But yes, proved it. The 30% claim was invalidated. He was removed from every professional registry in the industry. He left Seoul shortly afterward and I received, approximately 8 months later, a single message. He looked at the card on the table between them. Not a card. A different kind of message. Delivered through a mutual contact who was clearly uncomfortable being the vehicle for it. The message said, and I have not forgotten the phrasing because certain sentences embed themselves permanently. The message said, "What belongs to me has a way of returning." Cafe was very quiet. You believed it was a meaningless threat, Amara said. From a man who had lost and was processing his loss through language. I believed it was the last communication of someone who had been comprehensively defeated and needed, for his own dignity, to have the final word. He looked at the photograph on the table. At the handwriting on its reverse. I was wrong about that. I appear to have been wrong about several things. But here is what neither of them said aloud in that moment, what was sitting in the room with a particular presence of unspoken things. If Shin Do-hyuk had been watching Jae-won for 11 years, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that the most effective revenge is the kind that is felt rather than witnessed, then the timing of Choi Hannah's fabrications 3 years ago required re-examination. Jae-won saw it at the same moment Amara did. He could tell by the way her expression changed. The particular recalibration of someone whose understanding of a familiar picture has just fundamentally shifted. Choi Hannah, Amara said carefully, did not act alone, Jae-won said. You think Shin Do-hyuk. I think the evidence that destroyed our marriage was too sophisticated for one person operating from personal motivation alone. I think Hannah's resources were insufficient for what she constructed. I think someone with technical capability, financial backing, and a very specific understanding of my psychology provided both the infrastructure and the intelligence. He paused. And I think that person has spent 11 years waiting for the right instrument. She was the instrument, Amara said quietly. Choi Hannah. She provided the access and the proximity. He provided everything else. And my mother's surveillance operation may have been running parallel without either of them knowing about the other. Amara's voice had taken on the focused quality of someone working through a complex problem in real time. 3 separate operations. Your mother monitoring me to manage information. Hannah and Do-hyuk dismantling the marriage to isolate you. And now, 3 years later, Do-hyuk surfacing again through Lee Byung-soo, through Jong-un, through a note that forced me into a ballroom and put both of us exactly where he wanted us. Where he wanted us, Jae-won repeated. Which means the gala was not the endgame. It was positioning. They looked at each other across the small cafe table in the Jae-won Quarter with the rain still moving against the windows and the owner still performing elaborate disinterest at the far end of the room, and the particular, clarifying alertness of two people who have just understood simultaneously that the situation they are in is considerably larger and more dangerous than the situation they believed they were in when they sat down. Tobias, Amara said. Not a question. Direction. Where is he right now? Mrs. O. My neighbor. She collects him from nursery on Tuesdays. She was already reaching for her phone. He should be home by now, it is past noon. She stopped. Looked at her phone screen. Jae-won watched her face. What he saw there was not panic. Amara Osei did not panic. He had known that about her from the beginning. It was one of the first things he had understood about the quality of her, that she met alarming things with a stillness that was not absence of feeling but the channeling of feeling into function. What he saw on her face was something more specific than panic. It was the expression of a person reading something on a screen that their mind is refusing, on first contact, to fully process. She turned the phone toward him. A message from Mrs. O. Sent 43 minutes ago. While they had been sitting in this cafe reconstructing the architecture of 11 years of calculated damage. The message said, Amara, I am at the nursery. Ms. Song says Tobias was collected at 11:15. She says the person showed authorization documentation and an emergency contact form. She assumed it was someone you had arranged. He is not here. Please call me immediately. The cafe sounds continued around them. The rain continued against the windows. Somewhere outside a car passed through a puddle with a sound like something tearing. Jae-won was already on his feet. Already calling back. Already moving with the particular total focus of a man who has just had every other priority in his life reduced to a single consuming point. Amara was beside him, her bag over her shoulder, her face composed in the way that costs everything to maintain. Her phone at her ear calling Ms. Song with a voice that was steady and deliberate and gave absolutely nothing away about what was happening in the interior of a mother who had just been told that her 4-year-old son was not where she had left him. Beck answered on the first ring. Tobias, Jae-won said. He has been taken from his nursery. 43 minutes ago. I need every camera between the Seohyun District bilingual nursery and a 5-kilometer radius. I need it in the next 4 minutes. And I need you to run the authorization documentation that was presented at that nursery through every database we have access to. Already moving, Beck said, which meant he had been monitoring and had seen this coming in some form, and Jae-won filed that information away for a conversation that would happen the moment Tobias was safe and not 1 second before. They were through the cafe door and into the rain of the Jae-won Quarter, moving together with the synchronized urgency of two people who have stopped negotiating the terms of their relationship because something has made all of that entirely irrelevant. Amara's hand found his arm. Not for comfort. For communication. The grip of someone transmitting information through contact because words are taking too long. He looked at her. The nursery is 6 minutes from here on foot, she said. Ms. Song will have seen the vehicle. She notices everything, she is that kind of person, she will have seen the vehicle and the plates and the direction. Then we start there. They moved through the rain. Jae-won's phone was already generating the heat of 3 simultaneous calls. His head of legal. A number he had not called in 3 years that belonged to a man in a government building who owed him a favor of considerable magnitude, and who was, as of this moment, being asked to repay it. 43 minutes. A 4-year-old boy named Tobias who carried a velociraptor named Atlas and had given a presentation on hunting strategies to his nursery class and had his father's eyes and had never, not once in 4 years of living, been anywhere other than exactly where his mother knew him to be. Jae-won ran the arithmetic of 43 minutes. Calculated the radius. Calculated the variables. Then he thought about the note. Tell him what you found. Tell him before the gala. Tell him or the boy goes to Accra without you. The boy goes to Accra without you. He had read that as a threat about the relocation. About Amara leaving. He had read it as leverage applied to a custody situation, the kind of pressure that people with resources apply to people without them. He had read it wrong. The boy goes to Accra without you had never been about a flight. It had been a statement of intent. A declaration, delivered 3 days in advance, by someone who had been planning this with the same patient, architectural precision that had characterized every other move in 11 years of waiting. Shin Do-hyuk did not want revenge on Kang Jae-won's company. Did not want financial restitution or professional rehabilitation, or any of the conventional currencies of grievance. He wanted what the message from 11 years ago had promised. What belongs to me has a way of returning. He wanted Jae-won to lose something the way Jae-won had made him lose something. Not a company. Not money. Not a professional reputation. Something that could not be rebuilt. Something that, once gone, left a damage so complete and so permanent that no amount of discipline or reconstruction or carefully managed silence would ever fully address it. He wanted Jae-won to know exactly what it felt like to have something taken by someone he had never thought to watch. And Tobias, 4 years old with his father's eyes and his velociraptor and his entire unblemished life ahead of him, was the instrument of that lesson. Jae-won ran faster. Miss Song was standing outside the nursery entrance when they arrived. Her hands clasped in front of her with the particular stillness of someone who has understood that movement will not help, but stillness is its own form of torture. She was a small woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and an expression that combined professional guilt with genuine terror in proportions that told Jae-won everything he needed to know about her character. She was not a woman who had been negligent. She was a woman who had been deceived by someone who had prepared for exactly her level of diligence. Amara reached her first. Did not raise her voice. Did not collapse. Took both of Ms. Song's hands in hers and said, with a composure that Jae-won understood was costing her everything she had, "Tell me exactly what you saw." "Everything. The order matters." Ms. Song told it. A woman had arrived at 11:10. Not a man. Jae-won noted that immediately, filed it, recalibrated. A woman in her late 30s, professionally dressed, carrying documentation that included an emergency contact authorization form with Amara's signature, a notarized letter citing a family emergency requiring immediate collection, and a secondary identification card listing the woman as Tobias's paternal aunt. Paternal aunt. Jae-won felt something move through him that was not quite rage and not quite grief but occupied the precise territory between them with the weight of both. The documentation had been convincing because it had been constructed by someone who knew exactly what a Seoul bilingual nursery's emergency collection protocol required. Who knew the specific format of the authorization forms. Who knew that the secondary identification card needed to list a familial relationship that would not prompt a call to the primary contact, because a paternal aunt implied the father's knowledge, and Tobias's file, Jae-won understood with a clarity that arrived like cold water, listed no paternal contact at all. Amara had registered him as having no father. Not out of cruelty. Out of the protective instinct of a woman who had spent 3 years ensuring that the absence in Tobias's life did not become an administrative vulnerability. It had become one anyway. Shin Do-hyuk had found the gap and built a door in it. "The vehicle," Jae-won said. "What did you see?" Ms. Song described it. Dark 4-door, no distinguishing features, plates she had caught partially. 2 numbers and a letter before it had turned out of the nursery lane with a smoothness that suggested the driver had executed the departure before anyone's attention had fully assembled. Beck called as Ms. Song finished speaking. "Partial plates match a rental vehicle," Beck said without preamble. "Registered to a logistics company called Hanam Freight Solutions. The company is a shell, incorporated 14 months ago, single director. Address is a serviced office in Mapogu that has had no physical occupant since registration. The rental was arranged online, payment through 3 intermediary accounts, origin traces to a financial instrument registered in a name I am still verifying but which preliminary indicators suggest is connected to a Jeju Island holding that has Shin Do-hyuk's fingerprints on its incorporation documents. Cameras. Working through them. I have the vehicle on 2 street cameras heading east from the nursery. Lost it at the Seo-hyun district boundary where the camera coverage has a gap. There is a gap in that coverage that should not exist. It was reported as a maintenance issue 6 weeks ago. It has not been repaired. 6 weeks ago. Planned. The gap had been created or exploited in advance. The route chosen because it passed through dead space in the surveillance network. This was not improvisation. This was the final movement of something that had been choreographed across months, possibly years, with the patience of someone for whom patience had become indistinguishable from purpose. Amara was standing beside him. She had heard enough of Beck's side of the conversation to understand the shape of it. She was looking at the nursery lane where the dark vehicle had turned and disappeared, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has reached the absolute boundary of what composure can be asked to do and is standing at that boundary with everything she has, refusing to let it break, because breaking serves no one and certainly not the 4-year-old boy who needed his mother to be functional and ferocious and entirely present. "Atlas," she said quietly. Jae-won looked at her. "He never goes anywhere without Atlas," she said. "When they took him, Ms. Song, did he have his bag? His blue bag with the dinosaur on the front?" Ms. Song nodded immediately. "Yes. He was wearing his jacket and carrying the bag. He had Atlas in his hand. He was..." She stopped, steadied herself. "He was not frightened." The woman spoke to him calmly. "He went with her without distress," he said. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. He said, "Excuse me, does my mama know where I am going?" And the woman said, "Yes, your mama arranged everything," and he said all right and went. Amara closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. The precise duration of a woman allowing herself to feel something before the operational requirements of the next moment demanded her return. Then she opened them. "He is not frightened," she said. Not to Jae-won, not to Ms. Song. To herself. As information she needed to hold on to. "He is not frightened. He has Atlas. He is all right right now." "He is all right now," Jae-won confirmed. Because it was true, and because she needed to hear it from someone else, and because the alternative, the version of this where Tobias was not all right, was not a version either of them was going to entertain until they had exhausted every other possibility. His phone moved in his hand. Not a call. Message. From a number he did not recognize, which meant Beck had not yet screened it, which meant it had come through a channel that bypassed his standard filters. The kind of channel that required knowing the direct number. The kind of knowledge that implied sustained, proximate surveillance over a long period. He opened the message. Photograph. Tobias, sitting in the back seat of a vehicle, Atlas the velociraptor in his lap, looking out the window with his particular watchful calm at a landscape that was moving past too quickly to identify. He was wearing his blue jacket. He appeared, as Ms. Song had said, entirely unfrightened, with the composed, curious expression of a child who has been told a plausible story and has not yet encountered a reason to disbelieve it. Beneath the photograph, 3 lines of text. The first line, "He is comfortable. He will remain comfortable as long as you make comfortable choices." The second line, "You took 30% from me, Kang Jae-won. I have been patient about the interest." The third line, "Come alone to the Hanam Industrial Pier, Warehouse 7 by 4 o'clock. Bring the woman. Do not bring Beck or anyone connected to Beck. I will know if you do, and the boy's next photograph will look different from this one." Jae-won read it once. Then he handed the phone to Amara without comment, because she had the right to read it herself and he was not going to manage her access to information about her own son. She read it, handed the phone back, said nothing for a moment. Then, "He wants both of us there." "Yes. Which means he needs both of us there. Which means whatever he is planning requires our presence, not just yours." She was thinking aloud, processing at the speed of someone whose mind operates most effectively under pressure. If this was purely about making you feel loss, he would have taken Tobias and disappeared. He would not need us in a warehouse at 4 o'clock. He would not need a location, a time, a controlled environment. "He wants a witness," Jae-won said. "He wants me to watch something. Or he wants something from me that he believes my son's presence will compel me to provide." "The company," Amara said. "Vantera Group. What belongs to me has a way of returning. He said that 11 years ago. He does not want revenge, Jae-won. He wants the 30%. He wants what he believes your father's company owes him, compounded by 11 years of what he considers wrongful exclusion, and he has spent 11 years constructing the leverage to take it. The precision of it landed with the particular impact of a thing that is both unexpected and, in retrospect, entirely inevitable. Tobias was not the endgame. Tobias was the negotiating instrument. Shin Do-hyuk had spent 11 years building toward a single moment in a warehouse at 4 o'clock where Kang Jae-won would sign whatever was placed in front of him, because the alternative would be sitting across that table with his son's safety on one side of the scale and his company on the other. And Do-hyuk had calculated, correctly, that there was only one way that scale would tip. It was 3 minutes past 1 o'clock. 2 hours and 57 minutes until 4. Jae-won looked at Amara. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has already made their decision, and is waiting to confirm that the person beside them has made the same one. "We are not walking into that warehouse the way he expects us to," Jae-won said. "No," she agreed. "We are not. And we are not leaving Tobias in that building past 4:15 regardless of what is or is not signed. Absolutely not. Which means we have 2 hours and 57 minutes to understand everything about Warehouse 7 at the Hanam Industrial Pier that Shin Do-hyuk does not know we know." He was already calling Beck back. "And we have one significant advantage that he has not accounted for." Amara looked at him. "What advantage?" "He has spent 11 years studying me," Jae-won said. "He knows how I think. He knows how I move. He has built every piece of this around his understanding of Kang Jae-won operating alone, making unilateral decisions, carrying the weight of things without distributing it." He paused, looked at her with the full, unguarded directness of a man who has stopped performing composure and is simply being present. "He has never once had to account for you." Something shifted in Amara's expression. Not softness exactly. Something more structural than softness. The particular quality of a person being seen accurately and feeling the specific, unfamiliar warmth of it. "Then let us make sure," she said quietly, "that he understands his miscalculation." They moved together through the rain of the Seohyun district, toward whatever was waiting at Warehouse 7, toward a 4-year-old boy with a velociraptor named Atlas who was looking out a moving window with his father's eyes and his mother's unbreakable composure and absolutely no idea that two people who had spent 3 years failing each other were, at this moment, for the first time, entirely and unconditionally on the same side. Beck's voice came through the phone with the first piece of intelligence on Warehouse 7. And then Jae-won's mother called. For the second time that morning. This time he answered. And what she said in the first 4 seconds, 4 words, delivered with a tremor in her voice that he had never once heard in 39 years, stopped him completely in the middle of the wet Seohyun street. 4 words that meant the warehouse was not what they thought it was. 4 words that meant Shin Do-hyuk was not the only person waiting at Pier 7. 4 words that changed everything again for the last time. She said, "Jae-won, I'm here. If you have made it this far, then you already know. This story is not finished. Tobias is in that warehouse. Amara and Jae-won are 43 minutes behind him. And Kang Jae-won's mother, the woman who watched a grandchild exist for 8 months without saying a word, is already at Pier 7. The question is not whether they get there in time. The question is what they find when they do. And whether everyone who walks into that warehouse walks back out. Type part 2 in the comments right now if you need to know what happens inside Warehouse 7. Because part 2 is coming and it is going to be nothing like what you think. If this story kept you here from the beginning, do 3 things before you leave. Subscribe to Afro Korean Stories by K so you never miss what comes next. Hit the like button because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need these stories. And drop your location in the comments because this community is watching from everywhere and I want to know where you are. Tobias has Atlas. He is not frightened yet. But the warehouse is in 43 minutes. And Shin Do-hyuk has been waiting 11 years for this conversation. Part 2 is coming. Do not go anywhere.